Queen Elizabeth of England will die in 1603 without an heir to the throne, so a branch of the royal family ruling in Scotland will come to power in England. This is known as the beginning of the Stuart dynasty, which is going to become a period of trouble for England, and it's going to bring about absolutism in England as well. James I of Scotland will become King of England after Elizabeth dies. And as king, he's going to inherit a large royal debt and a very troubled nation. The church was fiercely divided between the Church of England and Roman Catholic. And when James I assumed the throne, he claimed that he was ready to rule by English law, although he was a Catholic. Since Parliament only met when summoned, James rarely summoned Parliament to meet. He developed new sources of revenue, such as a new customs tax, which is going to anger Parliament, as they were supposed to be the keepers of the royal purse. King James I is going to anger Parliament even more when he went against the Church of England. The Puritans, who wanted to purify the English church from any remnants of Catholicism, expected the king to further their goals, but King James does not do this. The biggest problem that King James creates was with foreign policy. He sought peace with Spain, which was a Catholic country, and then he tried to have his son, Charles, marry either a Spanish or French princess, both from very dominant Catholic nations. And he also aroused suspicion among Parliament and the people, and he quickly was seen as a pro-Catholic. This is going to lead to a lot of trouble for his descendants and for the English crown. King Charles I, who was the son of King James I, is going to become king after his father's death, and he will rule as king from 1625 till 1649. And King Charles picked up right where his father left off. He was a firm believer in the idea that the king was a divine right, which meant that God had placed him in the throne because he was chosen above all others to be king, and he was chosen by God. And Charles I began to behave like an absolute monarch. He would imprison political opponents, and he bled his country dry of money to further his plans. Eventually, he ran out of money and options to make money, so he was forced to call Parliament into session. When the members of Parliament arrived, they said Charles needed to sign a document called Petition of Right. The Petition of Right said that there could be no new taxes or political imprisonments without the consent of Parliament. And Charles really needed the money, so he signed the agreement. However, his next act as king was to dissolve the meeting of Parliament, and this would be known as the Short Parliament. In 1637, the religious practices of King Charles I started a war in Protestant Scotland. The king needed money to stop this rebellion, and so in 1640, he's going to be forced to call Parliament into session again. And this is going to be known as the Long Parliament, because they're going to meet over a 13-year period. And this meeting will eventually start a civil war in England. And the king was really struggling for power, and Parliament is going to try to stop this power. Parliament executes some of the king's chief ministers, and they said that they could no longer be dissolved without their consent, so the king wouldn't be able to stop their meeting. King Charles I is going to respond by leading troops into the House of Parliament to arrest the leaders. And this action is going to result in civil war as the leaders escaped and created their own army. And so the English Civil War is going to take place from 1642 to 1649. And those who supported King Charles I are going to be known as the Cavaliers. And they were named this for their dashing helmets and long hair. And the Cavaliers were made up of rich nobles and friends of the king. They were individuals who were not experienced with fighting. And then The other side, which will be known as the Roundheads, they were the ones against the king. They were mostly plain and ordinary countrymen with bowl haircuts. The Roundheads are going to pick a Puritan leader named Oliver Cromwell, who was a military, organizational, and strategic genius, and he is going to lead the Roundheads to victory during the war. In January 1649, King Charles I is going to become the first and only English king to be executed. The British Parliament will dissolve the monarchy, which shocked the royals in Europe. And if this could happen to the king in England, what might happen to their thrones? So for the next 10 years, there will be no monarchy in England. England is going to declare itself a commonwealth, and the person who will be put in power of the country is Oliver Cromwell. Now, Oliver Cromwell, he was very boring. He was a Puritan. He wanted to purify the Church of England, so he made a lot of laws in order to do this. So he shut down all the theaters. He made it illegal to dance. He limited the types of music that were played. He closed the pubs and taverns. Basically anything that was fun, he shut it down. And Cromwell said there was freedom of worship, but it was only for Protestants. Catholics were not allowed to publicly practice their religion in England. During Oliver Cromwell's reign, there are going to be many problems in England. Supporters of Charles II, the son of Charles I, and the rightful heir to the throne, began to attack England from Ireland. And this is going to force Oliver Cromwell to go into battle. In 1658, Cromwell is going to die, and now that he is gone from leadership, the people of England were able to admit that they were tired of having an overbearing Puritan leader with overbearing laws. And in 1660, Parliament is going to vote to bring Charles II back to England and return him to his rightful place as the king in the English throne. After negotiations with Parliament, King Charles II is going to return from Ireland to England, and he was known as being a great speaker. He had a great deal of political skill. He's going to bring back the monarchy to England, and he agreed to let Parliament meet. He's going to retract all of the boring laws created by Cromwell, like the banning of music and dancing and closing of taverns. King Charles II wanted to unite the people with religious tolerance, so he allowed freedom of worship for Catholics and Protestants only, and he stated that the people who were Catholic or Protestant were free to worship as they wished. He did have Catholic sympathies, though. He also wanted to make an absolute monarch of himself. So to achieve this, he avoided many of the confrontations with Parliament that plagued his father and grandfather, and he would do things kind of under the rug so they would not understand what was going on or wouldn't notice. The brother of King Charles II, King James II, is going to take the throne after the death of his brother in 1685. And he is going to really bring fear back to Protestants because he was a pro-Catholic. And James II is going to flaunt his Catholic faith. And he angered Parliament by making and abolishing laws at will without consulting them first. And he's going to replace members of Parliament who disagreed with him. And he would then appoint known Catholics to these high government positions. King James II is even going to imprison 7 Anglican bishops. And this attack on the church was just too much for a lot of people in England who felt that religious clergy were entitled to legal privileges. And King James II was acting like he was allowing for religious toleration, but what he was slowly trying to do was to make all institutions in England subject to his power. So what's going to happen in 1688? Parliament decides to invite King James II's daughter, Mary Stuart, and her Protestant husband, William of Orange from the Netherlands, to take the throne of England and to overthrow King James. This is called the Glorious Revolution. However, no bloodshed took place. It was a peaceful transition. In order to assume the throne in 1689, William and Mary had to sign a very important document. It's known as the English Bill of Rights. And the English Bill of Rights was written to limit the power of the monarchy, and it gave basic civil liberties to only the noble aristocratic classes, meaning only the wealthy people in England were guaranteed civil liberties. However, it was a start to greater participation by the people in the government.